buon pomeriggio a tutti i telespettatori di Telelondra. Oggi siamo in compagnia con il British Italian Conservative che ha organizzato un webinar dal titolo Global Trade Business. Is there still an opportunity? Insomma, parleremo di commercio globale grazie ai British Italian Conservative per un webinar sponsorizzato da Tratos del dottor Bragagni, che è anche diplomatico di San Marino qui in UK. Ci saranno ospiti importanti come il Ministro dello sviluppo economico dei Paesi Baschi. I nostri ospiti dovrebbero essere pronti, quindi dovremo passare ora la linea al webinar. Giusto un attimo di pazienza. Come sapete ormai si fa tutto online, quindi si stanno preparando. Partiamo ora la linea al webinar. Grazie a tutti.
So welcome to everyone to this webinar. I would like to open this meeting by remembering the International Workers' Day that will be celebrated tomorrow, the 1st of May. I take this opportunity to thank all the essential workers that in this difficult time of COVID-19 pandemic are carrying on with their duties. I also wish to thank all the NHS staff fighting against COVID-19 and all the factors workers for their support of overall community and for making our quarantine possible and safe. I propose to hold a moment of silence to honor the many victims and those who have sadly passed from the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, before I introduce the speakers panel, I would like to inform everyone attending today's webinar that questions to the panel can be made in the chat box. So the speaker panel, we have very privileged to have with us the Minister Arantxa Tapia Otaegi, Minister of Economic Development and Infrastructures of the Basque government. Arantxa is the Director of Standard of the Minister of Economics, Developing and Infrastructure of the Basque Country, member of the Parliament in the Spanish Parliament from 2011 to 2012, spokesperson for the economy and competitiveness, development, defense, education and sport and agriculture, food and environmental commission of the Spanish Parliament. From 2012 to 2016, she served as a Minister of Economic Development and Competitiveness. Since 2016, she has been Minister of Economic Development and Infrastructure. So we thank her for being with us today. The second speaker will be Dr. Ottonel Popesco, President of PEMA, Port Equipment Manufacturing Association. Ottonel, with 30 years experience in the port industry, initially with the ABB and after co-founder and CEO of Cavotec, a listed company. Mr. Popesco is the president of the Port Equipment Manufacturing Association, PEMA. Ottonel is actually serving as a chairman of a board of directors in various stock exchange listed and private international company, amongst others lastminutes.com, Fimer Group, Fidot Group. He holds various degrees and accreditation in business and scientific, like MBA. Then we are going to have Dr. Scott Sidman, Director of Standard BSI. Scott Sidman is the Executive Director of BSI Group and Director of Standards, where he is responsible for the BSI's activities as a global standard organization and its role as the UK national standards body. An engineer by background, Scott spent several years in an academic at Cambridge University before moving to industry, working in infrastructure projects in UK and around the world. He joined BSI in 2012. Scott has been Vice President for the International Standard Organization, ISO, since 2017. He's a former Vice President of the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Institute of Civil Engineering. Thanks, Scott, for joining us. The Right Honorable Greg Clark, MP, Chair of the Science and Technology Selective Committee, former Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and British Italian Conservative patrons. Born in Middlesbrough, Greg Clark attended the local St. Peter Comprehensive South Bank. He went on study economics at the Cambridge University and was awarded with his PhD at the London School of Economics. Greg worked for the Bolton School Consulting Group. Greg has served as a government minister for 9 years continuously, 5 in cabinet, including most recently as a Secretary of State of Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy. For those who are new and they don't know who I am, I'm Maurizio Bragagni, chairman and co-founder of the British Italian Conservative, and also honorary consul of the Republic of San Marino. Finally, I would like to present the guest speaker who will ask questions to the panelists, Dr. Simon Blagden, Vice Chairman of the British Italian Conservative and Industry Chair for All Party Political Group, APPG for ICT, Dr. Alessandro Belluzzo, President of Italian Chamber of Commerce, and Dr. Pablo Fano, Managing Director, UK and Ireland at Basque Trade and Investment. Now, it's time to leave the floor to our panelists. The question that we ask them is very simple. Global trade business, is there still an opportunity? Minister Tapias, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you to the British Italian Conservatives to this invitation. And I hope I can give you some details of what's happening here in the country and how we see what's happening from a very small country and very internationalized and so the economy here in the Basque country has been like a disaster in the last month because we were growing at about 2% of GDP. And nowadays, in the last month, the economy has fallen about 3.6 of the GDP. So,
sorry, Tapias, we have a problem of hearing you well.
Really?
Now, yes. Now we hear you very well.
Okay, sorry. So I was telling you that it has been a total disaster from the economy point of view in the last month. And because of the state of emergency that the President of the Spanish has declared in the middle of March, more or less, there was a big debate here in the Basque country and the whole Spanish area because the President of Spain wanted to switch off all the economy. Of course, bars, restaurants, shops, and whatever, but also industry. And we didn't agree because the debate between what is first or what is more important, if health or economy, it's not a real debate. We need healthy people to have a good economy and good industry, and at the same time, we need industry in order to have enough money. We need financing for a good health system. So they work together, and it's a real debate. So we wanted to have a small part of the economy, a small part of the industry working, and we did so. So our industry, even if it has been quite difficult, they have been working at a small level, but they have been working, and I think that it has been so important to maintain a small part of the economy in an active way. Nowadays, we are working at about between 50 and 60% of our industry is working, with contracts coming from 3-4 months ago, but they are active. And now the most important thing is to active demand, because as everything is still closed, we need demand. For instance, for our automotive sector, it is important to buy cars, that people buy cars. But if everything is closed, the demand is almost zero. So we want to start opening the economy, opening all the economy. And we have had a meeting, an electronic meeting on Monday with all the industrial sectors, and they told us which are the main concerns they have. And of course, they want to maintain their people healthy, the workers healthy in a proper way. But at the same time, they need financing. They want to survive. And they want to survive not only at the local area, but they want to survive internationally. And things are not going to be in the near future. So we want to work on this battle because our economy, our industry depends on the international area. And it is sorry, can you hear me in a problem? Yes?
Yes, now yes.
No, I think I have a kind of problem. There are concerns on our economy related to international position. What's going to happen with contracts, with clients? What's going to happen on the supply chain? How can we diversify the supply chain that sometimes is located very, very far from our country? And we want to reshore some of the activities and at the same time to have a kind of agreement with other countries which are near Europe, near our country. And finally, I would like to say something else, that sometimes our people abroad, when we talk about our economy, say that we are a bit interventionist. But we work together with our companies. We try to establish strategies and work together in order to make our country be international and be well positioned. And nowadays we feel that other countries in Europe are doing so, are working with a lot of their companies in order to be well positioned and to get out of this crisis. And taking into account two important things from the Brussels point of view, which are how we can continue with digitalization, and how can we take advantage of the new Green Deal in Europe with new opportunities related to that, and how our new industry is going to grow based on these two things. But again, internationally, things are going to be changing a lot. Trips are not going to be the main issue of the internationalization policies, and we have to analyze what can we do in the near future and for the next year also. So things are going to be changing, and we want to be there. We want to be global, but we want to know how we can help our people, our country, and our industries also. So maybe this could be the main issue our companies are going to deal with in the near future. And as an industrial country, it could be an opportunity, but we have to be very, very active in order to have new partners. And of course, the UK could be the partner we have always had, and the one who is going to be one of the most important in the European area, together with other partners that have been together with us in the last years. So Pablo has a lot of work over in London in order to work for opportunities and to work with our companies, knowing that they could not go, they cannot go to London or to the UK in the next future. So our offices abroad would be or will be in the next future the offices and the ones who are going to get our companies to a good position globally. So I think that of course we are in a very bad position. It's a total disaster, but at the same time we have opportunities. So let's try to get advantage of the opportunities and continue growing when this health crisis finishes. Now that we have people that could be in not a very good position, maybe unemployed, and we have to take care of them, and at the same time take care of the health of all our people, workers, and general people. So this is the situation now in the country, how we think we can start working much for this opportunity again.
Thanks, Tapias. Ottonel, Popesco.
The British Italian Conservatives and the chair for the invitation. Again, these views I'm going to give are based on my personal experience. They're not made on behalf of the association or the companies I represent. Yes, we, the humanity, are at war, but for the first time, we are all on the same side. And this is a big opportunity because the time of crisis is also a time of opportunity, as I said earlier. And I think we should focus a little bit less in reading only negative news and also to think what is coming positively from this pandemic. First of all, is a drastic change in consumer behavior, not only due to the temporary social distancing, but this is going to affect the global trade. What is going to change? If you remember some decades ago, the globalization started. It was driven mainly by cost-reducing criteria, bringing us to a complex supply chain with factories, suppliers, research and development towards the Far East for the Western markets, as said, for cutting costs. This era of the globalization was already under severe pressure. Now with the pandemic, this is the latest challenge. And I can see three scenarios coming. So one of the scenario is the localization instead of globalization. It means shortly that the national governments can adopt protectionist policies to relocate production facilities closer to home in order to avoid reliance on foreign suppliers. Another scenario could be the regionalization instead of globalization. This means, as an example, a factory in the Far East will sell its products locally using Far East suppliers, and the same brand will also do the same in Americas, using US factories or American factories and using local suppliers. This is going to lead to a very strong process of regionalization. The third scenario could be a continuation of globalization. So globalization will return to pre-coronavirus levels. These are the three main scenarios. I would say that there are no general rules unless the governments, they are going to make them mandatory. At the end, there are two scenarios. Or we are going to regionalize. As I said earlier, a mobile company, I would like to give names, will manufacture in China, and they are going to use Chinese manufacturers, suppliers, and also use the same other facilities in the Americas, for example, for the American market. The other one is the globalization. There is no change. What we should understand is this is requiring a lot of adaptability, and it will be customized for each country or each organization. And this is going to take time. People thinking that we are going to change immediately after we are going to find a vaccine or immediately this virus is going to end is not going to be like that. It's going to take time. All this globalization is going to continue, but in a different way. And there are a lot of opportunities in trade, yes. And one of them, as I said earlier, is of course the innovation. This is an unprecedented time to innovate, or companies which are not making innovation, they are facing extinction. That's important. Just remember what Alibaba did in 2003, if my memory is good, when it was the pandemic or the epidemic of SARS in China. They launched the first consumer market and they become now one of the largest companies in the world. So they immediately adapted. This type of crisis, they are allowing innovators to think much faster and create a lot of changes. And this is something I think we need to remember. I can give you some ideas. Again, there are simple ideas. I would say some activities which within the end of 2021, they might have a positive impact. Consumer goods like the food and retail, IT technology and software, the telecommunications, freight transportation, clean energy, life sciences, agriculture. Others, they are going to suffer a little bit more. Eventually the transportation, eventually the travel, eventually some automation. So today, no one and nobody has a magic ball or a magic stick to say it's going to be like that, like that. We see something important, like I said earlier. There is a change in the behavior of our way of consuming. And the last point, this is regarding the stimulus. We are seeing these trillions going and coming into our industries, in our country, sorry. And you all know that the stimulus of trillions, they're not going to be enough, because simply the governments, they are going through the banks, they are lending money, so the money needs to be paid back, one part of that. And secondly, because we need to go back to work. That's very important, respecting the rules. But this is something, as the minister said a little bit earlier, it's very important that we go back to work, respecting, as I said earlier, rules and being conscious on what we are doing. We cannot stay in this situation for longer. And the globalization is going to go on. As I said, there are different scenarios. I'm confident that we are going to pass this crisis, and the humanity and us, not only as humans, we are going to go, and we are going to go out stronger.
Thanks, Ottonel. Scott, your point of view.
Thank you, Maurizio, and good afternoon, everybody. Good day to you all. I'm most impressed and appreciate the opportunity to say a few words, Maurizio. Thank you very much indeed. And really also to pick up from the previous two speakers who have spoken so well about so many of the issues. I think this point about globalization, but globalization in a different way, is perhaps at the heart of what I'd like to say today. Think global, act local, perhaps. So perhaps I could start with three sentiments, and then maybe three examples of where I think there is opportunity. And my first sentiment is that we're all in this together. That's what we've learned. I mean, it's blindingly obvious. We've argued for some years about protectionism and globalization, but actually it's pretty clear now that the only solution for mankind in addressing whether it's sustainable development goals or economic growth is to work together. We need greater interoperability, we need capacity to respond to crises like these, and we need an increasing recognition that that's going to involve relationships between us. So this whole point about global solutions that give us the versatility, the flexibility that we need, seems to me to be absolutely fundamental. It will be different to the cost-driven globalization of the past, but it will be globalization in the sense of coming together around global solutions. My second sentiment is that I think people need people. I asked my 30-year-old daughter what she thought about this, and she said, I need to get back to the office. I need to be back with my friends. I need to be with people. I mean, it's all very well living and working like this on a screen, but it's not what we were for. It's not how we're built, Maurizio. So people need people. And I've read lots of coverage that says people will think, oh, it's the end of office working. But frankly, I don't agree at all. We will see more agility in the workforce, I'm sure, more people avoiding the rush hour and offices, perhaps in a less traditional environment. But the isolation, the loss of productivity, the impact on mental health and well-being, these are challenges that for the majority of the working population will mean that I think people and employers have a joint interest in getting back together. We are living on web conferences today, but it's a valuable tool, and we've all learned that, but it's not a long-term substitute for those face-to-face meetings and the development of human relationships. And I think my third sentiment is that organizational resilience is really going to be a key issue for enterprises everywhere. By organizational resilience, I mean information resilience, as the minister described it, supply chain resilience, and operational resilience, the people bit of it, the business continuity bit. And I think organizations not just playing at it, but actually doing it, whether they're SMEs, micro SMEs, international corporations, Tratos, or governments, they're going to do organizational resilience now. So I wanted just to turn to three examples where, of course, through the lens, the extraordinary lens that international standards brings, I could perhaps illustrate some of those points. And the first one is that we're seeing now today, practically every day, the search by manufacturers willing to gear up production around the world is opening their eyes to new markets. Manufacturers have been in their own supply chains, those stretched global supply chains, for so long, but suddenly they're being introduced to new markets and new ideas, new standards, new opportunities, and that is going to stimulate innovation, pivoting, and disruption in a whole new way. Whole countries are out there looking for sources of PPE and raw materials. There's a huge disruption happening of those stretched supply chains that are going to shake down new ways of doing things, new business opportunities, and are definitely going to drive trade. Whether that is this new form of global trade, where you are manufacturing somewhere else, or whether it's in the regional or national context, it will drive business. So businesses want to source components and they want to offer services to multiple markets as part of a much more horizontal, a more dispersed supply chain, less of a vertical supply chain, more of a dispersed supply chain, where standards allow links in a supply chain to be switched or moved quickly, resiliently, easily. So you could be sourcing from one country, but then there's a crisis, you source from another country overnight. You need standards to do that. Second example, I think, really exemplified by the concept of factory in a box. This is an interesting piece of work that's going on in the UK, agile, scalable manufacturing, where you have a rapidly deployable, remotely managed modular manufacturing. So this is all building on that Industry 4.0 digital economy, flexible working, but where you see, stimulated by the COVID crisis, you see manufacturing moving into a more versatile, less labor intensive, more flexible form of production. Again, all of that completely dependent on having interoperable components, digital and standards that will underpin that. So it will really drive market opportunities for lots of manufacturing companies, perhaps even Tratos, Maurizio, to your great company. And my third example, I think, is in the collision, the fusion of these two huge drivers. One, this global pandemic that we are all wrestling with today, and secondly, the Sustainable Development Goals. So the concept that we've been moving towards in London, in the UK, towards the concept of sustainable purpose, corporations that have sustainable purpose. And we see that, first of all, coming through sustainable finance and the new international standards that have been developed for sustainable finance, where investors are saying, we've got plenty of money, but actually we only want to invest in corporations where we can be demonstrably assured that you are meeting the SDGs, you're doing your part wherever you are in the world. So in this post-COVID world, where we think about companies building back better, I hear this every day, build back better, we see leading companies really taking their position. They're taking stock of what's happened, that every day we were just too busy to think about it. But now we've been forced to think about it. We've been driven home and forced to think about the future. And suddenly, as we build back better, we want to not only recover those markets and pivot into the new markets that these opportunities are definitely going to provide for us, but how are we going to do that and address the SDGs at the same time? So I really do believe passionately that this is going to be a turning point where corporations, responsible corporations with purpose, are going to pick up the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're going to say, we're going to build back, we're going to build back better, we're going to build up better lives for our people, supporting our governments, we're going to do that globally, and we're also going to do that locally. Thanks, Maurizio.
Thanks, Scott. Greg Clark.
I start by thanking you and British Italian Conservatives for bringing us together in this way. It is the contributions we've had from our colleagues so far just show the value of being able to pool ideas, not after the crisis, but during it, because it's important that some of the decisions that will be taken by policymakers and people in industry are happening over the next few weeks. And so it's great to have this opportunity. The question that we've had posed is is whether global trade still has an opportunity. And I think it's evident from the three speakers so far that the answer is yes to that. And it's a very important question. But there are four reflections that I would like to make that might govern how the opportunities for global trade in the future might be addressed. And the first thing is to note and to agree, as others have implied, that this is an important moment for us all. We didn't expect to go through this, and we will be changed by it. And there's an important aspect of this. Right at the beginning of the crisis, the debate in the UK, and I dare say in other countries, was that this was a sudden act of God, if you like, something that had come out of a clear blue sky, was unrelated to the conduct of the economy before. And so the policy response had really been to freeze the economy and preserve it as best we could, so that once the pandemic had passed over us, then it could be turned on again and we could resume business. That, you know, viable businesses, successful businesses needed to be kept operating, or kept able to operate after the pandemic could be switched on again. I think there's an appreciation that the model has changed. I think that was the right initial response, and some of the support packages that our countries have put in place were necessary for that. But actually things are not going to be the same again. It's not going to be just a question of turning the light switch back on. Clearly there are sectors that are going to take some time, longer than others, to recover. Travel has been mentioned. That is very evident. The hospitality industry is probably going to be slower than manufacturing, and so there is going to be a different world that we need to adjust to. And it's also the case, as has been said, that we won't go back to do everything the way that we did before. No doubt people's experience of online ordering, for example, is going to change the way that people buy food, for example, and the way that we go to restaurants and to shop physically, that may change and may never quite go back to what it was before. So we have to understand that things will change. But on the other hand, not everything will change. Given the radical dislocation that we're all experiencing, it is important to reflect that some things, I think, will continue. For example, to take something as basic as food supplies. I don't think it is the case that the British palate, for example, is suddenly going back to eating potatoes and roast beef for every meal, and that we will lose our developed appetite for the products of Italy and Spain and countries all around the world. In fact, it's notable that pasta is now considered to be a basic when it comes to emergency supplies here. And so I don't think that the consumer is going to want to refuse the idea that they can have access not just to foreign and overseas produced foodstuffs, but to the products from around the world that we have enjoyed and that we've got used to. I think that appetite will be there for that. Our companies are increasingly internationally owned and operated, and some of our strongest companies are those very international ones, and that internationalism, it seems to me, is not going to change. And indeed, there is a resilience in international operations and international ownership. And it also seems to me that what we are experiencing may seem to be sudden, but in many respects is an acceleration of trends that were already discernible. In the UK, all participants will know that the debate and the concern about the future of the high street and the retail trade, given the possibility of e-commerce, has something that has been occupying us for some time. So there will be, so not everything needs to be started afresh. But my third observation, and talking to manufacturing companies and their representatives in particular, I think there will be pressure from policymakers and on policymakers to have what one might term a flight to resilience. This will be seen, I think, to be an event that we need to be better prepared for in future, and in every aspect, from our health services to our supply chains in industry, there will be a test of resilience that will be applied. And here I think is a point of danger for international trade, because I think it would be possible, and we've already seen some instances of this, to think that resilience means national self-sufficiency, that is the way in which you can protect yourself and your citizens against a future shock, do everything that you can within your own shores. I think, in fact, that is a false comfort. In fact, resilience comes from diversity and agility. To take the current crisis as a case in point, the fact that different countries have experienced COVID-19 at slightly different times and are coming out of it in different ways actually means that it is possible to, as Scott was saying, to if you're agile enough to be able to source supplies from those countries that are coming out of lockdown, even when your own country, as the UK still is, has tighter controls. And so I think the notion that trade actually contributes to diversity, I think is important. But as others have said, I think the agility of trade to be able to make decisions in the light of what is happening in the world, perhaps more quickly than we have been used to in recent months and years, I think will be important. The ability to surge, for example, access to supplies, I think will be an important feature, as will some, I think, greater investment in stocks, for example, to give some greater reassurance, and some local manufacturing capacity. But there again, this is a continuation of a trend that has been evident in recent years anyway, as in manufacturing, more and more there's been a concern to have some domestic capability. And so my fourth observation is that given that some of these decisions will be contested, and in particular, I think there will be arguments against deepening and extending international trade. I think it's very important that this debate is joined, especially by manufacturers. The contribution that Scott made about the importance of standards in this, crucial to be able to be interoperable and to be able to source flexibly. I think that is important. It's a good opportunity, good moment to emphasize the importance of standards. I think it's evident to everyone that the coordinated international response has not been as evident and has been in some ways rather disappointing compared to some of the global coordination that took place in response to the global financial crisis. And so I think there is a requirement to remedy that during the time ahead. And I end with this. I think we're convened to think about trade, and many of the participants I know are manufacturers. I think this is a very important role for manufacturing, because one way or another, manufacturers are in a position to lead the way out of the crisis and of the pandemic, more perhaps than can the service economy that serves people at real live events, such as in restaurants and concerts and opportunities like that. Manufacturing is probably better placed to come out of this strongly, and so to get the rules right for manufacturing, I think will be important, and manufacturers collectively will be a sector that can be forging the path as to what is necessary, whilst other sectors may have further to go before they recover.
Thanks, Greg. Simon Blackden, Vice Chairman of the British Italian Conservative and Industry Chair for the All Parliamentary Group APPG. Simon.
Thank you, Maurizio. And first of all, thank you for the great insight that all our panelists have given. It's so interesting to hear their views at such an important time, I think, for industry and business, as we are starting to try and understand how things will change. My question is based on international global trade. We've seen very much both the media and politicians in the UK and in Italy very much focusing on national issues. In fact, all of the countries around the world focusing on what's important to them right now as we face this pandemic and crisis, which is very understandable. And my question is when we come out of this pandemic and we start trying again to reinvigorate our supply chains and our businesses and industry, how do we measure the success of international trade and global trade in terms of the success of the recovery? Do we measure it against what the levels were like before the pandemic? And will that be a good measure? And what part will international global trade play in the recovery process?
So it's a question for all the panelists. I would like that we started in the order that the people have started. So Tapia, would you like to?
I will try to answer not only from the UK point of view, because of course we are in another country. But first of all, I think that, of course, without international trade, it would be impossible to recover. And I take our consideration and our experience as a small country. If our companies, if our industry is not global, it will not be in the future, because we are a small country, so local demand is very small. The Spanish demand is small, so we have to be international, we have to be global. But there's a position that is interesting. We have to think global, but at the same time act local. And why do I say this? And I'm going to introduce you to an example that has been happening with this crisis. We have been investing a lot of money, a lot of investments in research and development for pharma and for medical devices in the Basque Country. But now, during the crisis, we have found out that, of course, we have investment on research, but we don't have manufacturing, and we don't have enough capabilities to attend and to respond to all the needs of our health system. So sometimes we think global and we think about that everybody in the world is looking for this kind of manufacturing and this kind of services. So let's buy outside, but sometimes not everything has to be international. So we have to combine local and global. And in this case, our manufacturing capabilities can be applied to health services, and we have learned a lot in this sense. So international, of course, but at the same time, look at yourself and try to analyze what you can improve in your health sector in this case, or in your country as a whole. So you have to combine together with health and economy, you have to combine local and international and global.
Thank you. Ottonel? Ottonel, we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay, so as I said just 30 seconds ago, measuring the success, it's a tough question. I would say that 2019 it should be a benchmark. We like it or dislike it. This crisis is going to take some years or some months. We do not know exactly how long to recover. Globalization is going on, no discussion. We are going to, as I said earlier, we are going to have a change in our way of consumption. And this is happening already. You can see what is the new trends right now. I would say that we cannot live without globalization. We like it or dislike it. I was asked by a lot of people, what are you going to do with the factory in this country? Are you going to move it back there and there? This is not a decision you take like that from the blue. This is going to take time. And we should not forget people thinking that they're going to delocalize companies from China and from this area. The Far East today is one of the largest markets in the world. So we also need to think of that. So the globalization, yes, we are going to measure that. I think 2019 is one of our benchmarks, as I said, is going to go on. I just received a question regarding the ports and what is the container trade going to do in the ports. I think it's going to come back, not immediately. Depends on how long this crisis is going to stand. I am cautiously optimist for the next, I would say, 18 months. This is my point of view. So it's going to take time. We need to get used to what is happening and believe that this is going to end and we are going to come stronger from this crisis. This is time of opportunities. Remember, we have opportunities in front of us. And one of the examples which was given just earlier was related to sustainable energies. This is going to be one of the drivers in the future.
Thanks, Ottonel. Scott?
Thank you, and thank you. Simon, thanks for that very interesting question. So your question was around how you measure trade in future. And then I asked myself, so what is trade in the future? Is it containers on ships? Or is it something slightly different? I met a man last week who brews beer from the crusts of bread, waste products from cafes. And someone asked him, are you going to export your beer? And he said, no, you really don't understand at all. I make beer from waste products. So the idea of making beer from a waste product and then shipping it somewhere is completely flawed. I need to give my recipe to the other country and they will make beer in their kitchens or in their offices themselves. And then I think of people living where they choose to live, but through the internet, being able to offer their labor somewhere else. And why not? I mean, we already see that through call centers, but imagine a world where you could take people who lived in areas of your country with low productivity and offer their services to other countries. People could choose to live and work as they saw fit. Then I think of digital flows moving around the world. I think that in BSI, we have medical device experts who live in America, and they're assessing products being manufactured in China to be imported to the UK. this isn't so straightforward to work out what trade is all about. So let me come back to the very interesting work that we're doing now on sustainable purpose and sustainable finance, and the concept that if we have an international standard on in sustainable investment, then we can understand what trade means in the world of the net zero, the world of the future. If we are on a journey to net zero as countries, then surely we need to look at trade in a slightly different way. And yes, we need to count the containers, but we also need to count other measures as well. So I think you've asked a very insightful question, Simon, and I'm looking forward to continuing that discussion with you.
Thanks, Scott. Greg?
Thank you, Maurizio. So the question as to how we can measure the contribution of global trade in the future, I'd like to interpret it through people's valuing of it, the perception as to how important this is, because I am very alive to the danger that people think that this is a virus that has swept around the world and the world is a dangerous place and we need to insulate ourselves from it. And I think this can apply to trade. And so I think we need to place a great emphasis on having an understanding of the importance of trade. Obviously, access to medicines is very foremost in people's minds at the moment. In the UK, we have, I think, about 12,000 prescription-only medicines, almost all of which are manufactured overseas. We absolutely need trade flows to continue and to expand if we are to keep people as healthy as they expect to be. The jobs that depend on not just the exports of final products, but the import and export of components. Infrastructure, I think, is going to be very important in the UK as in every other country. Absolutely essential to our infrastructure investment is the contribution that is made by international suppliers of it. And so the measure that I have a particular interest in is the measure of the understanding of the positive contribution to people's lives and to jobs that trade brings. And I worry that it perhaps has been something that has been taken for granted at the moment. Something's happened that can knock confidence and lead people to think in some ways this might be a dangerous thing to be internationally connected. And so the measure that I would set for myself if I were in government responsible for trade is to achieve a public understanding of the importance of trade. That is an essential condition, it seems to me.
Thanks a lot. Alessandro Belluzzo, the President of the Italian Chamber of Commerce, question to our panelists.
Thank you, Maurizio. Thank you, everyone. Of course, I'm glad to be here presenting the chamber. And my question is very simple. I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room, or better, the elephant in the Zoom call, which is Brexit. Of course, Brexit may be an issue with COVID and the combination of COVID with Brexit. Do you think, in a very short sentence, that COVID will create an impact on the Brexit process? And how do you expect it to have an international trade, as we are discussing, that is already at risk because of COVID, coming together with the risk of Brexit and disruption of Brexit? Thank you very much.
Well, I think that is a specific question to you, Greg. I think for an obvious reason.
Of course. So we had our general election in December before COVID came on the scene, and the majority for the government, I think, made very clear what was required, and I think that is understood in the UK on all sides, and I think it's understood internationally as well. I think the weeks and months ahead could advance the final stage, or the next stage of the discussions on trade for two reasons. One is that these discussions can be conducted and I hope make progress without the day-to-day political contention that would probably otherwise attend them. Those that have been appointed to lead the negotiations, David Frost and Michel Barnier and their teams, I hope even virtually will have the ability to really concentrate and perhaps make more progress than they would if this was the center stage of the political debate. And so that's one way in which I hope more progress can be made more quickly. And the second is this, that it's evident that both the UK and the European Union economies are going to have a lot to deal with, as this conversation this afternoon has demonstrated over the years. And so when there is an opportunity to resolve some outstanding issues in a constructive and a positive way, and to avoid adding to uncertainty and problems, then I think there should be in people's minds a real premium on at least injecting into our international relations across Europe and our economy some welcome stability and agreement. And I hope that the value of that will be something that will be high up in the minds of both UK and EU negotiators, and that the combination of having the time and the space to devote to it, and the even greater importance to a successful resolution will enable this at least to be a point of agreement, given that the context, as I said at the beginning, is a decision that was taken not many weeks ago, but very clearly through the general election in the UK, that we need to bring this to a resolution.
Thanks, Greg. Scott, would you like to comment on this question?
Yes, thank you, Maurizio. And of course, I'm not speaking as a politician, but on behalf of industry. Industry has to think ahead a lot, and so industry has thought about post-transition, as we call it. The UK now has the status of a third country, and so the question is post-transition. And all that we've talked about today, this afternoon, trade, manufacturing, digital flows, this is all underpinned by international standards. And in my remarks earlier, I said that in my view, global solutions need global standards. So what we expect to see is that there will be a further keen interest from industry globally in sharing one standard used everywhere. So in that respect, I can, from a standards perspective, both with an ISO hat and with a BSI hat, provide assurance to everyone that we will continue from the UK perspective to be a leading supporter, leading advocate, user and maker of international standards to be used globally on the premise of one standard used everywhere is essential to underpin both governments, both industry, and to support society. So post-transition, the UK will continue to use international standards as the basis of industry's requirements. So from that perspective, I think that we can work on that basis that will sustain trade in the future.
Thank you. Pablo Fano, from the Managing Director of UK and Ireland and Basque Trade and Investment. Pablo, a question to the panelists?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Maurizio, and thank you to the British Italian Conservatives and, of course, the four panelists. I would like to ask two separate questions. The first set of questions would be addressed to Minister Tapia and to Ottonel. This would be regarding geopolitics and global trade. We have seen how the COVID crisis in China first, before it spread to the rest of the world, has affected the global supply chain. And during the health crisis globally, how we have been lacking of medical equipment and protective equipment worldwide. So what kind of effect is that going to have in a potential localization of manufacturing of such items at the global stage? And my second question that would be probably addressed to Greg and Scott, more at the UK level, following that trend or potential trend of manufacturing locally at a greater level, and also considering the result of the general election in the UK, where prominent manufacturing locations that used to vote Labour have voted for Conservative government, maybe expecting an increase in manufacturing jobs. And how does that play at a potential revival of manufacturing in the UK? And how could foreign investors participate in that if that is an actual possibility? Yeah. Thank you.
So Tapias and then Ottonel and then Greg Clark and Scott, please.
Thank you. I will try to do it quickly. Okay, we have seen that, as you said, Pablo, our value chains and our supply chains have been disrupted because some parts of our our key components of the supply chains come from Asia as a whole. So we have had some problems. But this could not be the reason to reshore everything and to say that our supply chain has to be here in the Basque Country as a whole. I think, and we think as a government and talking to our industry, that we have to diversify maybe and to have a part of our value chains in Asia or in Africa or in America, and to have some parts of these key components localized both in the Basque Country and in Europe as a whole, but not only one place to diversify, but to have different places to have components, key components for our supply chains. And on the other hand, if we look at the health system, of course, the whole European countries, and I think that America also, we have gone to China to have part of our protective equipment related to health equipment. And of course, we are not able as a small country to produce, to manufacture every equipment we need. But at the same time, we need to have some part of this equipment capacity, to manufacturing capacity for this equipment here in the Basque Country, because we have learned a lot from this crisis. And if you depend totally on a third country, wherever it is, maybe China or not, you are not able to have your decisions made in a proper way. So you have to combine the global situation together with the local one, as I have told before. So coming from a small country as the Basque Country, we have to combine both. Not everything local, but not everything global.
Ottonel?
Yes, well, the localization, I would give a very short example. This is the story of the masks. Everybody is talking about masks since 2 months. And suddenly this is becoming a strategic product. I can tell you that, 3 months ago, we never even know what a surgical mask was. Now, suddenly everybody is thinking to bring back the masks in Europe. This is an example. I think that, as I said earlier, in the past, we made this globalization with the idea to reduce costs. And this is why we delocalized. We need to be fair and say we were moving production in some countries because we wanted to reduce costs. Now we are paying the consequences. I'm sorry to say that. We like or dislike, and this is going to continue. It means that we cannot at once bring everything back what we did 30 years ago. It's not possible. So the globalization is going on. We are going to have still some strategic industries which are going to be back. I do not know which industries, so this is not up to us to decide. I think the governments, they are going to be involved in that. But for sure, there is going to be a change in the localization of certain industries. And this is, we were investing in the Western world too much on services. And this is clear. I'm not saying it's a mistake. We went with the globalization, we went with the trend. Now we need to rethink all of this strategy.
Thank you. Scott and then Greg, as always, the order.
Well, thank you, Maurizio. I talked earlier about the importance of flexibility and interoperability. I talked about the concept of factory in a box. We've talked for some years about the idea that it would be quite straightforward to have small manufacturing units that were remotely operated in out-of-town shopping malls, maybe next to a supermarket. All of that is now very realistic to me. And I imagine that one simply, to the minister's point, you're looking to manufacture locally those components that you can't bring from somewhere else. There are different sorts of masks. We've been talking a lot about that in the UK recently. At least 4 types of masks are needed in this situation. One for frontline health workers, one for surgeons, one for the general public, and so on. They're different sorts of masks. So it's not obvious that there's just one mask. And we need to be very agile to be able to do this kind of mixture of local, adaptable, probably higher end batch manufacturing in country, but also resourcing and identifying sources of raw materials that we can bring through our international trade networks, respecting international standards and approving them and delivering them at speed. So the rapidity of this crisis has been a terrific test for the world. And other crises have happened at a lower scale, more geographically located, or a slower onset. But there's a lot of learning here. And I really think we're seeing the acceleration of some very interesting trends. And there will be innovative companies who start to pivot and offer basically that local manufacturing capability. We've already seen it with 3D printers being used to do things at slightly small scale, but we'll find ways to adapt that. All of it requires a currency, and that currency, I'm going to say it again, is international standards, giving you the flexibility to switch and adapt and deliver what you want, where you want it, whether that's in the north of England, to the question, or whether that's in South America.
Thanks, Scott. Greg?
Thank you, Maurizio. I think there's going to be an intensification of interest in manufacturing over the months and years ahead for a number of reasons. One is that I think tech and manufacturing are the 2 groups of industries that have the possibility to lead us out of the crisis. It's where social distancing, for example, is more possible than it is in some of the other more service-oriented sectors, personal service-oriented sectors. I think that is one reason. I think the second is that there is now an interest, for reasons that Scott and others have said, in questions which are an effective industrial strategy. That we need to think ahead. We need to make sure that we can satisfy ourselves in anticipation of future unexpected events, that we have the capacity and the supplies available. And although this has recently come back into favor, there was quite a long time in which questions of industrial strategy were not prominent, and to some extent were considered to be rather old-fashioned and time expired, that we had such a dependable global market that we could, in effect, trade in a global spot market and always count on things being available. I think the people and governments will now pay greater attention to understanding the resilience of supply chains, to understand where things come from, and so there'll be a greater concentration on that. And the third reason is, it was adduced in the question, we have in the government, comprising the government's majority, a lot of members of parliament who've been elected in constituencies in where manufacturing industry is very important. they will want to be members of parliament, not just for one term, but to continue. And actually, less cynically than that might imply, I think they will develop a familiarity with the needs of manufacturing, which they will bring to debates in the House of Commons. And so I think the House of Commons will be much better informed on some of these key questions about the future of manufacturing and its needs, and therefore in international trade, than perhaps has been the case for some time. And I think the government will be shaped by that, but also has itself an appetite for it.
Thank you. I think that I'm going to read a few questions to all of you and leave it the opportunity to answer to the panelists and also to our people that have just joined us. We have now a very big competitor because the Prime Minister is speaking live in this moment. So our audience has been reduced. I just let you know because that is the final remark. So I would like to suggest there is three main questions that they are coming. One, it's very simple to all the panelists, is you do not think that fear will be really effect to all our business and trips on the future? One of the most other question that is coming is what will be the long-term impact on the corona crisis to how we work? And the other one is when do you think that we could travel again all around the world? Again, I would like to ask also to all our panelists from Tapias, Ottonel, Scott, and Greg, and of course that will be the last opportunity to talk, and then also we'll ask to our three other guests to make some comments. So Tapias.
So first, I think fair is going to be something very, very important, and it's going to avoid us to travel a lot in the next months, but it's my opinion. But at the same time, I think that we have to learn to live with the corona for months and months. So all the protective issues, all the social distancing, and maintaining this kind of measures will be key for the future to recover part of our life. I don't think it's going to be the same until a new vaccine is discovered, but we have to get out. So we have to start living, we have to start improving the economy, and we have to continue. So this is one of the important things that we are thinking about. So sometimes living in fear will be something that we have to learn again. I don't remember the second question, sorry. And the third one was about when is going to finish this crisis, and I would like to say that I don't really know. So I think that we have to continue in the sense trying to maintain our economies, because if we maintain the economy, we will maintain our employment and our quality of living, and this is very important in the future. So try to live with this virus for some months, trying to do our best in all the areas.
Tapias, Ottonel.
Okay, so but fear is human, so we can't do too much. We are all human, so this is something we need to live with. I would say that this crisis is going to stop. There's no discussion about that. We are going to have some other behaviors in the next month, maybe 1 year or even more, who knows. And regarding the travel, look what is happening in China. In China, they started to travel. If you go to see some of big players in the tourism industry, so the people, they started to take the planes. They are not traveling as before, as in January, or I'm speaking also in December, but it's back. So slowly, we are also going to be there. Important is that we are respecting the rules. Our governments, they are telling us this social distancing and all the protection. This virus is going to stop. We should not wait the vaccine. The vaccine is the ultimate stuff. We need to fight and work, not waiting, saying, I'm waiting the vaccine. This is why my input, again, is let's go back to work according to the schedules in each country, to respect what we have been told, and I leave the fear at the door. The fear is not going to make us going back.
Thank you. Scott?
Yes, thank you, Maurizio. Yes, people, there is fear, and I've seen that locally to where we are now, particularly amongst people who have no experience. They've seen a lot of news. It's been very frightening. They don't know anybody who's had it, and so they're worried. But actually, I think that's a great pity, because it's not a solution. It drives wedges between people, and it makes them fearful about going to work, and we must do that. It makes them fearful about, so it's not productive. And I sincerely hope that we can work on trust as an alternate. And from a standards perspective, we will, and we were talking with our industry organizations today about standards to support employers so that they can build trust with their workforce, with the unions movement, with the public, that they can be trusted to go not just to meet the government requirements, but to go beyond and say, no, trust me, I'm taking this seriously. We need a culture where we are accepting that there are dangerous viruses in the environment. This one happens to be the one at the top of the news today. But of course, there are many other people in our communities who are suffering from other tragic diseases, and they are, in some sense, being neglected. So we need to tackle that head on and talk about trust, not fear. I think we will change the ways of working, and responsible employers will look to do that in a common way, so that people, whether they are moving jobs or whether they're working for several, they will feel comfortable that they're working in an environment and giving their labor and being respected for that. And that's all part of the learning process that I think will come out of this crisis. So yes, we will work differently in a more agile way, in a less traditional way. But I still think, as I said at the outset, people need people. We have to have and enjoy those human interactions, and we'll find ways to do that. Maybe the underground will be less crowded at rush hour, but there will be ways to do this, and that may bring its own environmental benefits. Travel, I think, is really fundamental, and whilst I've no doubt, and we see it from the airlines, their predictions are a massive drop in travel. People don't want to travel. Actually, I think in the medium and long term, there will be an upsurge in demand for travel. We have a very mobile young generation who are very determined to get around the world. I don't think they're going to stay at home. So it will be very expensive for some time, but particularly the business community must find a solution. And I might have to turn to our political leaders and say, please, you're going to have to come up with a common structure that will allow business to move around the world in an organized fashion. It will be expensive, I'm sure that's the case. And the private citizen may, for their own reasons, either not afford it or not want to travel for some period. But over time, I think that will build back. And I've no doubt that you just can't expect that if we achieve sustainable growth, economic wealth, and rising in the standard of living around the world, people will travel. I mean, we just have to find ways to do that in an innovative and greener way. So I think there is going to be more travel, but it's in the long term. Thank you, Maurizio.
Thank you. Greg?
Thank you, Maurizio. We're fearful when we face the unknown. We don't know what's going to happen, and when things seem out of control. And so it's not surprising that, especially in the early days and weeks of this crisis, people were intensely fearful and retained that. But I think there are some sources of optimism that fear can subside. One is that in our countries, at least we're beyond that phase when things seemed to be out of control. We didn't know what the rate of infection was going to accelerate to, whether hospitals were going to be overwhelmed. And I think that sense of not knowing whether we can control it, I think we're moving beyond that. And so some of the fear associated with that should subside. And as every day and every week goes by, we're learning more about the disease, how it can be managed, how it can be contained, what its effects are. And so the fear that comes from the unknown, I think, will also start to subside. And that would be important because the flip side of fear is confidence. And confidence, as we know, is one of the foundations on which an economy is built and needs to prosper. So it is important that we slowly and perhaps sometimes imperceptibly rebuild that confidence and reduce that fear. There are clearly changes that are going to be made, probably some that we won't know yet, into how we live our lives. I suspect a sadness for me that when we next meet each other physically, we probably won't shake hands initially, and I think that's a sad thing. It's a sign of affection and solidarity that is a nice tradition. That's a trivial aspect, but there'll be other ways in which how we conduct ourselves at work, the space that we have between each other, will probably endure for some time, at least until we're safe from this transmission of this disease. In terms of travel, again, it comes from knowledge.
Sorry, Greg, to interrupt you, but the Minister Tapia has to leave us, and I didn't want to. I know that she was a previous engagement, so thanks a lot for being with us, Tapias.
Thank you.
So, Greg, please.
So I was finally going to say, I think as we know what we can do that is safe, and we can have confidence rather than fear around that, that applies to travel as it does to working arrangements. And so, as others have said, not comprehensively, but bit by bit, I think we will find ways in which we can travel again. People do want to see people do want to see places, and we will, I think, gradually recover the ability to do that. But it's probably not going to be, I think, as everyone knows, a turning on of a switch that will restore us to how we did things immediately before.
Thanks, Greg. Simon, would you like to? It's time to, unfortunately, we have got a lot of questions, and I have promised, sorry, Craig, sorry, Scott, sorry, but I have promised to all our participants that you are going to answer those questions. So because you cannot answer in that way, I really ask to just that you write a written answer to the question that has been raised. In particular, there is, of course, Aunt, there is Andrea Arrigoteca from CAF. There is a lot of other people that I think that it's time really to pack up. So, Simon.
Well, thank you, Maurizio. I mean, what an absolutely wonderful session it's been. Our panelists drawn from such different backgrounds and with such interesting views, but it's so common in their views on some particular areas, which was interesting. I mean, Minister Tapia talked about the international supply chain and the need for, how digitalization could also play a role. And Ottonel telling us about how localization and regionalization was going to be the order of the day rather than globalization. And I love his comment about innovation, not extinction. And Scott, I mean, how interesting to hear from him about the way he believes the agility of business is going to be important, and organizational resilience and the dispersal of the supply chain. But I think the takeaway I went from him was that people do need people, and there's hope, I think, through this crisis that we will all get back together and be working together again. And Greg, what a wonderful insight. I do remember the wonderful work that Greg did as Secretary of State in launching the industrial strategy, which I think was one of the key successes of the department BEIS during the time he was leading it. And to get his insight on how the business model has probably changed and will continue to change. But also one of the most important things he said was that surely manufacturers were going to lead the way in getting us back out of this crisis. But on behalf of British Italian Conservatives, I'd really like to thank all of you for giving your time, our panelists. Like all of us, you're very busy, but to have that insight was wonderful, and thank you very much. And as important, thank you to our members and the people who joined both live on the webinar and via YouTube as well. It's really good of you to give your time. British Italian Conservatives is the most active group in Westminster of its kind. We have a very wide membership, not just British people or Italian people, but a very diverse group of members. And those of you who are watching today and aren't members, you're very welcome to join us. Please go and visit our website. And we have a number of up-and-coming events like this, which I think you'll find very stimulating. And thank you last to our chairman, Maurizio Bragani, for hosting this and chairing it so effectively and well. And we look forward to all of you joining us again in the future. Thank you once again for your time. And perhaps I just leave with the thought that Greg Clark gave in his last question, which was, let's look forward again to meeting and shaking hands. Thank you very much and good evening.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Bene,
Bye-bye.
Bentornati. Abbiamo assistito a questo webinar molto interessante su quello che sarà poi.
Allow for cruising to go back into operation. It will
Ci vediamo tra circa mezz'ora per il briefing giornaliero del governo. Come sappiamo ci sarà il classico briefing probabilmente condotto da Johnson, quindi l'appuntamento è tra circa mezz'ora.